got my phone out.
To life decisions. Harry, are you ready for us? Was that a yes or a no? Yes. Okay. Hi. Hello. Good morning. Welcome to Saturday morning at the Radical Book Fair. I am not Jessica Gaetan Johannesson, unfortunately for you. Poor Jess is sick, but she is also one of the most prepared human beings in the world, and therefore she had her questions ready a week in advance, and I am merely going to be channeling her wisdom, insight, curiosity about three extraordinary books with three extraordinary writers. I will give them each a brief introduction, and then they're going to tell you each a little bit about their work, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to invite you into that conversation about books and activism and bringing the written world into the real world, how we connect it with the real world, and how the real world connects with the writing that we do. Not me personally, Jessica writes, I don't write. Hannah Lavery is an award-winning poet, playwright, director, and workshop facilitator. I would encourage any of you who don't yet know Stellar Queens, which is an amazing new project that hasn't been mentioned anywhere, but you've been involved with, I have got a wee note with, is it Stellar Queens?
Stella Quines.
Stella Quines.
Sorry, yeah, Stella
Quines.
Quines.
My accent. And to get out there in the world for art and performance by incredible artists, incredible women in Scotland. We've got Mo Tonsi, who is a queer Egyptian writer, ceramicist, and PhD graduate from the University of Edinburgh. His writing has appeared in Misna, Epoch Press was shortlisted for the MFest 2021 short story competition and won a quarterly John Byrne Award. His debut novel, You Must Believe in Spring, was just published and is on the table over there as well. And our final writer for today is Emily Kenway, who is a writer, activist, and former policy advisor. Her first book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, showed how exploitation operates in the world today and was described as a powerful treatise in The Guardian. Her second book, Who Cares? The Hidden Crisis of Caregiving and How We Solve It, is out in April 2023. Will you all join me in giving our three writers a very warm welcome? And so our running order for a wee introduction to your work begins with Mo Tonsi.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's just such an honor to be on stage with you two. And just to kind of, I guess, an introduction to the intersection of my writing with activism. Like, my history of writing and activism kind of weren't intertwined until they became kind of like inextricably entangled with each other. I participated in the protests in Egypt in 2011 and its aftermaths, and that's where I lost 18% of my lung capacity from nerve gas attacks onto the protesters by the police and the military. A lot of the pieces that I wrote were memoirs, and a lot of it essentially just was me trying to work my way through what was happening, because obviously, kind of like with everything going on, with all of the radical movements happening, there wasn't really a lot of time to actually sit and ruminate. But yeah, I guess the biggest thing that I've published around that is You Must Believe in Spring, which has quite a few personal bits and pieces in it, but it is essentially fiction set in 2031 that also looks onto the legacy of the 2011 revolution and how the stories that we inherit of that past will kind of like echo into the future. And yeah.
Next up, Emily.
Thank you. So I was thinking about this event when we were asked to explain, we were asked to talk about kind of our history with writing and activism and how they intertwine or don't intertwine. And I think for me, I've ended up writing the kinds of books I've so far written because of very formative experience in my adolescence, where I grew up with an older sibling who was heavily involved in anti-capitalist, anti-arms trade direct action, And at that age, when I was 12, 13, observing this, I didn't really understand the underlying reasons for why they were saying the things that they were about capitalism and so on. Obviously, arms is fairly straightforward, but the kind of deeper analysis wasn't something I had access to at that age. So it seemed kind of mysterious, but something I knew I wanted to know about. But I was also really afraid of what was happening. So this activism brought a lot of policing into our lives, police harassment, police violence, and kind of the threat of bailiffs coming to the door because of things to do with arrests and so on. So at that age, I was kind of intrigued and knew it mattered, but quite afraid. And it was really a particular genre of book that held my hand into becoming an activist, into finding a political self, which is your kind of more popular political books. So at that time, it would have been like Joel Bakan's The Corporation, Nerina Hertz's IOU, these kinds of books, Naomi Klein's No Logo, and so on. And I have, therefore, this great affection for that genre of book. And it really taught me that, and I very much hold to this, that there are many modes of activism that matter. So we might organize in our workplace, we might put our bodies on the line at anti-raids or anti-eviction protests, but we might also read and write as a form of activism, and that's as vital as anything else. And so it made sense that I would use my deep love for writing, which has always been there, as a form of intervention when I was then working on labor exploitation, human trafficking, sex worker rights, these things. And that's what The Truth About Modern Slavery sought to do, is to provide an intervention onto this topic that was being misinformed to the public, deliberately instrumentalized by politicians. And I hope that the book on care next year does the same, to try to illuminate this very much hidden crisis of unpaid caregiving around the world.
Thank you so much for that. Hannah.
I feel now that I should hold the mic, because everyone's holding their mic, but I'm going to hold it here. They asked if I wanted to hold a mic or not hold a mic, and I was like, I don't want to hold a mic, and now I feel like I've got all these hands that I can do things. Sorry. It was interesting to kind of pose that question, wasn't it, about our writing and who we are, and introducing our work and how that plays into activism. And I think for me, I mean, I grew up in a house, or my mother was an active trade unionist. I was surrounded by her campaigns on social justice, and so I think I've always had that sense, and I've always been quite clear about that in some part of me. But my writing for me, I think initially my writing for me was a way, and my reading was about a way to try and understand the world, and I think that idea of my attempt to try and understand the world through writing and reading, I think, has kind of, become activism. But I don't think I was that kind of conscious of what I was doing. I think maybe there has been work I've done where there've been deliberate provocations, and there's been deliberate, some of my work is asking people to consider and to look, and it's about empathy and building empathy and about belonging and who gets to belong and who gets to tell their story. So I think that is rooted in a sort of a childhood growing up in a home where I had a parent who was actively trying to make the world a better place, whether that was through, trade unionism, being a nurse, I spent a lot of my childhood going to marches, and I spent a lot of my childhood listening to political speeches. So I think there was always a part of me that I knew that was important, and I knew the power of words, I knew the power of that. So I think it's an interesting thing about how, and I was thinking about yourself as well, about how much sometimes telling our own story becomes part of a wider, or it becomes a form of activism. And I find that really interesting. It's been something I've been thinking about a lot, about just articulating our own experience. So maybe it's more of a quieter thing, perhaps, maybe.
Would you read us one of your poems?
Okay. I had to borrow a book because I forgot to bring it with me. So I might read this poem. So I wrote a poem in this collection called The Anti-Racist Working Group, because I found myself in a lot of these sort of invited into a lot of panel discussions and a lot of conversations around anti-racist work, and obviously I grew up doing a lot of anti-racist work as well. So but I was interested about the way in which post-2020, how much these conversations felt like you were coming into people having the beginning of these conversations when forgetting the kind of history of this activism in this work. So I'll read this. It's called the Anti-Racist Working Group. They apologize for their lateness, and the one that should really be here won't be here. Don't worry, it's fine. This is the first meeting of the Anti-Racist Working Group. Adjective, befuddled, unable to think clearly, confused or perplexed. Even in my befuddled state, I could see that they meant trouble. He worries that thinking of him like that is racist. Black? Her face and my face. We share a look which even on Zoom we both recognize. Past tense, befuddled, past participle, befuddled, make someone unable to think clearly. The logic used to arrive at this conclusion befuddles me. We arrange to talk after the meeting is done. We wonder why they thought they had anything useful to say. What were they thinking, she says. What the hell was the thinking? Befuddled, befuddle, befuddling. We sort of laugh, wonder how long it will be before they move on, wonder if they are starting to realize that they don't want to give anything away. Hush now, hush now, hush. And thank you. I sort of wanted to share that poem just for one little thought I've been having about the thing that's happened, I think, when when we've been, the othering that's happening and the isolating experience of that, of when we have been asked to come into our workplaces or into conversations where our experience, our own humanity is being very deliberately othered, and that a lot of these anti-racist work, especially within the workplace, especially when we're having to confront people's own ignorance or naivety or lack of education around issues, and we're put in that position of educator, it's a really profoundly othering experience. And so I was hoping that poem, when I wrote that, I wanted to sort of show that. And I think a lot of my work, I suppose my activism of my work is showing, not telling, is saying people come and sit beside me in this experience and try and see what that feels like and see that. So that's probably where my activism is. Yeah.
There's so many elements in what all of you have said that I want to pick up on. And it's interesting that you would bring that up, Hannah, in that the sort of origins of Read, Think, Act, that creation that we had, Jess and I, was born of a response to the great ordering of books in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, when it seemed that a lot of Annie and Susan had decided racism was a thing, and they were going to buy a book and they were going to post about it on Instagram and they were going to fix racism. And we had this huge flood of orders, and there was an initial excitement, I think, with a lot of people. One, it was great that books were being bought by writers of color, by Black writers especially. But then the next bit was, well, what are you doing with this? And are you reading it? And are you engaging with it? And it seemed as the months went on that maybe that wasn't happening. And that maybe we had thought that we could read ourselves into being a better nation and a better people. And so we wanted to explore, as booksellers, that responsibility of you read, and then you have to think about what is that reading done for you, or what thinking went into the reading and the selection, and then what do you do with that? Because we are of the world, and you can keep informing yourself of injustices, and you can keep widening your knowledge, but if it doesn't translate into something, how do we negotiate that, what that experience is? Which was why, and it happens across all different kinds of reading, which is why Jess thought it really wanted a panel that reflected different genres, that our reading and the doing can be connected to anything from poetry to fiction, to non-fiction, polemic, whatever it might be that you pick up. What do we then make of that? So Jess's first question was, we often take the connection between books and change-making for granted, hoping this event will be a chance to really have a conversation about what we mean when we say that books change lives with folks who are both phenomenal writers and engaged in social justice. So, are there risks involved in overestimating the power of books, especially in the context of a publishing industry that is itself mired in inequality? So are we overestimating the power of books first? Who might want to jump in?
I mean, I could...
Yeah, go for it, Hannah.
I don't want to jump in because it feels like I'm pushing. It's a big question. It feels like there's a lot in that question. So I think first is... I mean, when I was hearing you, my instinct was about what it is to be a reader. Mm-hmm. And that in a sense, I think reading, I mean, I think it's only the beginning of something. So I wonder whether we're offering, and I love this series we're doing, because it kind of, the series that you're doing, because I think it offers that next step. So I think a lot of people will read it and then they don't know what to do. And I think... And often when you create this work, I don't know how you feel like people have to go, oh, what shall I do? Tell me what to do. What should I do now? And I think that's always quite hard to ask a writer, because you're like, well, I did my thing, so I don't know what the next thing for you to do is. But I sometimes think, and I've especially thought about the phenomenon of lots of people reading these books, I felt to me that they thought that was enough, and that was all they had to do. But then I also think there wasn't enough clear sort of routes to what to do with that information. So I think that maybe that was my response, is it just feels like that reading's only part of the yeah. I don't know.
Emily, do you want to go next?
Yeah.
You've raised the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we can know that something is flawed and still appreciate its contribution. And that's definitely how I feel about books, in terms of the hope that they can bring and the change that they can incite, but may not. And as I said earlier, I think they're one mode of many forms of activism and an important intervention. Humans are also obviously different, and different things will incite activism for different people. I'm often faintly amused when people talk about inclusivity as being largely around visual things rather than written. I have a learning difficulty that makes visual things much harder for me to understand, and numbers much harder for me to understand. I would much rather have an essay given to me than have to read a chart. So people are different, and we have to remember that. And related to that is something that I think when we talk about action, it's important for us to remember that people have very different life circumstances and availabilities of action to them. So I've spent about 6 years either as the unpaid carer of someone, and therefore having my life very much dictated by that, or interviewing and speaking with people who are unpaid carers or the people that they're caring for. And just to kind of understand that we can have a hierarchy of activism, where we think, well, you're not on the front line, so what are you really doing? And it's, that can be good. That critical friendship can be good, because actually maybe we should be putting our bodies in the way more than we are, but that's not available to everyone. So maybe it's legitimate sometimes that people are reading. And then come in places like Lighthouse and lots of other book groups around the country, and individuals who give people certain books at Christmas and so on, where we can start to try to spread the seed of the knowledge that we're gaining. The other thing I'd just say is, like, as a published author, I feel, and I know a lot of other authors who are published by Radical Presses feel the same, that you have a duty to directly link your work to crowdfunders, campaigns, organizations, when you are publicizing it. And I think that's really important, that people never walk away from hearing about your book or put it down thinking that that was the job done, that there is something else to do. Yeah.
How about you, Mo?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think when it comes to kind of engagement with the reader and audience, and kind of what I expect from them coming after reading the book, yeah, it very much depends on kind of what the audience member is capable of doing. Because I mean, writing a book like this, almost kind of like I was forced to contend with the question of activism, because essentially a lot of what I write about is actually I can't talk about it in Egypt. So kind of like that question of activism, I had to go into it with a lot of intentionality, because what am I doing with the space that I'm occupying? How much am I educating, and how much am I kind of like what is my responsibility in that sense? Because obviously kind of like I had a certain project in mind that I wanted to put across, and I wanted to stay true to that, and rather than not let myself almost kind of like be shoehorned into a certain corner by like just expectations from the industry. And that's why kind of like going back to kind of what Emily was just saying right now, it's incredible to kind of like have such a supportive publisher and such a supportive press that will actually kind of let you do something slightly differently. Because yeah, I feel like my writing, I try not to over-explain. And for a lot of people, if it's their first gateway into kind of like reading about Egypt, it might almost be a bit too obscure. But I don't think it's a bad thing to actually ask more from our readers than to just kind of like absorb the material. I think it's fine to kind of like ask them to go out afterwards and explore more and research more. I don't think that's, yeah, I think that's a very important thing, and establishing a community around that is very important, because I feel like when it comes to activism, and even the books that were formative for me, reading them was only the very first step. I never actually kind of like felt any drive towards a call for action until I sat with other people and actually talked about it. Because until then I was just felt very abstract and just, yeah.
And I think that thing about activism being the first start, like it isn't an act of imagination a lot of the time, unless you know, because I think there's that idea of solidarity and coming together, maybe not even for your own self-interest, but for other people. There has to be that, and that's what writing can do. It is about that tool of empathy and that act of imagination. I feel like that, so it's incredibly important. And I think you're right. It's about privilege of, you know, there is a sort of, you need to have a certain amount of privilege to sort of take part in certain types of activism, but it can be such a quiet thing. It can be about imagination. It can be about having feeling emboldened to have a conversation with one other person because you've done the reading, or I think that's so beautiful about how there's so many different ways at coming at it, and you're having to find your own place within it. I think that's really...
Yeah, and it's, I mean, it's kind of like just what we were talking about before as well. There's a lot, yeah, there's a lot to be gotten out of that reader interaction, where it's, yeah, you provide the person with a thing, and then they will have multitudes of readings, and I think that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so interesting, that idea really that books have a role to play for ideas to percolate, for empathy to be expanded, just for the ideas to start existing in people, so that when they then interact with the world, they're maybe more equipped to either navigate a conversation and know, okay, well, actually, I have information on this, and I hear you talking about, say, sex work, and I happen to know that that's not true, this stereotype that you're presenting, because I've read this book where this author has given me these stories. Or conversely, you know, whether it's that poetry, those little voices in the background where suddenly you are sitting in a room with somebody you've been told is an educator, and they're the other, and they're giving you something, and you're there taking, to see them as a whole human being, because in the back of your mind, there's a poem that allowed you to sort of exist in the mind of someone else for the space of those words. Jess's first next question was to you, Mo, and she writes, writing about oppression, resistance, and uprising in Egypt, and publishing the book in the UK, how do you approach the idea of who you were writing for, and which conversations the book could be part of?
It's a very good question. I think it took me a while to actually figure out, because I wanted, like I knew in the beginning my intention was to obviously kind of like address it to, like primarily first and foremost towards Egyptians, because I think a large part of what I wanted to achieve is actually build up a space where we can have dialogue, where we can have conversations about kind of like the things that hurt. So I think primarily it was for Egyptians, but then it was kind of like very odd, obviously, to just start writing in English. But I think for me at that time, I almost kind of like needed that distance and that space from the actual language, because it just kind of like reignited way too many kind of like traumatic feelings that I needed to that I couldn't handle all at once. And just, so yeah, but I think the way that I kind of approached it is that I really had to key in on the voice to not foreignize it, even though it is kind of like essentially kind of a foreign tongue. Like it's not in the language that the narrative is lived in. So yeah, just to kind of like get the tempo, and also to not over-explain things that they would ultimately know. And there is a lot of use of language of where I kind of like directly kind of employ Arabic without translating it. And I think that was very important to kind of like, not just to kind of like lend some superficial authenticity, but also to get a sense of just the vibe of the place. And just because there is something about kind of like the layers of non-understanding in the novel that I really did want to get across, because a lot of times in Egypt, you're left feeling that the answer to the question you're asking is just out of sight. And I wanted to kind of like impart that experience onto the reader a little bit.
And I found it very interesting the way it's quite rare for a novel to begin with an author's note. And it felt like, can you talk a little bit about why that need to sort of offer enough context to people who might not know the sort of political or historical situation in Egypt to sort of preface the full novel experience?
I think it had more to do with kind of that sense of responsibility that I was just kind of like referring to, and it wasn't necessarily to, I mean, partly obviously kind of like to educate, to give a brief bit of context. Something that I refused to do actually for the writing of the book was to provide a timeline to accompany it, right, because I felt like that would kind of like almost try to just categorize certain events as being more important. But the author's note, I felt like I can do that, and that provides enough context, but also kind of like takes the responsibility to frame this novel that I'm presenting within a very certain sphere, so that people are aware that this is like where it exists. It's not purporting to kind of like speak for all Egyptians. This is a very particular experience, and I wanted to provide that context so that people actually know to go out and kind of like explore more and put in that effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Before I ask Jess's next question to Hannah, it was just to say, we are talking about whether or not books change lives. And I think for many of us, that's instinctively true. So afterwards, I will be sort of putting it to you if anyone wants to share a book that you feel did change the way you see the world, live in the world, exist in the world. So there is an opportunity beyond just a question, a comment on such a book will be welcome in this particular event. So the next question was for Hannah. When it comes to addressing systemic harm and violence, what kind of directness do page and stage provide respectively? For you, what possibilities for inspiring change lie in each?
Wow. It feels like essay questions that need to go away for 2 weeks. I mean, I think it's probably something I said before, and that idea that what we have, I think, as poets and as playwrights, part of our job really is about empathy. It's about building or creating space where people can, so there's that invitation. And for me, a lot of my work, I was thinking, especially around the lament that I wrote for Sheku Bayo and about how that was looking at kind of institutional racism in Scotland. And that was, for the way I wanted to create a lament which was an invitation to grieve and a space for grief. And I couldn't do that without creating a space for people to come in and it's a difficult challenge because we live in a country where we deny that we just don't, a lot of people just don't believe that we have institutional racism. And you know, the inquiry starts again next week, and it's going to be focusing upon the institutional, like the police and the justice system. And really, for me, without doubt, there's really strong evidence. And I think that the inquiry around Sheku Bayo is going to be bigger than the Macpherson inquiry. It's going to be massive because it's really showing how racist this country is on an institutional level. So how do you write about that? How do you take an audience on that journey? How do you get them to stand beside this family who have been ignored for so many years? And for me, it's empathy. And for me, it's about how you come to that and invite people to come to that as mothers and as sisters and as lovers, and to bring that humanity, because what we were, and not to sort of invite a defence, not to invite, which is a lot of people of colour get in Scotland, which is that immediate defence. This is not true. You don't know what you're talking about. So how do I do that? So for me, that's what poetry and theatre, I think, can do, is about creating empathy, and it's about invitation. It's about come sit with me. And I think there's lots of different ways that we can challenge institutional and violence and institutional racism. And there's so many ways we can do it. But for me, in terms of trying to create change, there is something about that empathy and that and offering people a moment to have an active imagination. And I was thinking, especially what you were saying about going off and finding, I think it's also about creating curiosity, isn't it? So for very much in my piece of work, it was like, I'm only going to tell you the stuff I could find as a citizen. So I didn't want to tell Sheku's story. I wanted to tell the story that was there in the press that we'd ignored, and that was the family, the voices that the family, what the family were trying to say. And it was just like trying to create a curiosity about, why don't you know about this? Why are you not doing anything about this? And for me, it was about hopefully people turning up to the public inquiry. That was the change I wanted. I went to the public inquiry. For most of the time, it was me and maybe one or two other people that were there. So it didn't work. Right? That's how I feel. Like, I created this play, I had huge amounts of people that watched it, I had all this people emailing me. When it came to public inquiry, the first day there was trade unions that are always there. You know, the anti-racist groups, the people that have been coming to these things for 40 years, all those other people, all those people that went on Black Lives Matter marches, all those people that put the things, and all these people that bought all these books, they weren't fucking there. Right. And I was there day after day, and it was me and one other person, and the family. Right. No one came. So I don't know if it does work. That's how I feel right now. I feel really depressed about it, because I'm like, no one fucking shows up. You know what I mean? It's the same, and usually it's the same in this country, the anti-racists, it's the South Asian community that are there every step of the way with that family. No one else is there. Right. And I just go, so you can create work, you can create empathy, you can offer people, you can give invitations, but actually, is it activism or is it just, so I don't know. That's a depressing point, but it's like, well, we can only, I suppose, create an invitation, a curiosity, a hope. But it's not enough just to come and consume it, and it's not enough to go away and feel better about yourself. Like, sometimes that's how I feel that we do. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah. Sorry to be so depressing.
No, but I think it's such an interesting question, because again, it's like, how do you measure impact? How do you measure what's translated? Is it, you can only do what you can do and put it out into the world, and then you're relying on other people to either take up the invitation, or those who have a responsibility to act, to take that to people and say, well, this next. You bought this ticket. Are you going to be, here's the link where you can, show up. Yeah. The sort of final question from Jess, and then I'll bounce it up to you lot, was for Emily, who said, so many conversations must have gone into the truth about modern slavery, as well as your upcoming book on care. Are there moments of possible activism in the research process itself that are possible to expand, to bring readers into outside of the book?
We got sent some questions in advance of this event, and none of those questions are what have just been asked to us.
I mean, you can ask the other question,
No,
Jessica.
it's fine. It's just really funny. It's a really good question, but I'm just amused by the questions we did get sent. Yes, so it's a lovely question, actually, because I think with kind of books like The Truth About Modern Slavery is like a pure non-fiction book, kind of a journalistic, I suppose, book, but based on my fury of working as a policy advisor on trafficking and modern slavery and seeing the absolute bullshit that was happening and the way that it was being deliberately instrumentalized by government. So it is a very angry book. And in terms of that book, kind of moments of activism within it, it's a really interesting process when you're kind of interviewing people and that kind of thing. One of the interviewees throughout the book is a ex-policeman who used to run the Met Police's Modern Slavery and Kidnap Unit, whom I've known for a number of years. We've been in sort of meetings together, and through our conversation that is recorded in that book, he was very clear that it makes, absolutely no sense for immigration to be a policing matter. From a policing perspective, it's idiotic, let alone anything else. And that, is not something that's said very much by very senior policemen. And it was because we were having these conversations over sausage butties that felt like quintessentially policey for some reason, and that you do have these conversations where you're bringing a sort of particular perspective and then kind of digging into and trying to excavate what someone actually thinks beneath the ideology that they've been trained into and taught into. I think that the book itself, I do think it's a form of activism, and I have then strategically deployed it in that way since it came out. So making sure it was in the hands of journalists who were reporting on that topic very problematically without any awareness of kind of the rights and justice and agency issues in that narrative, the immigration policy issues and so on. And producers, there are hopefully going to be some dramas coming out in the next couple of years on, like, unfortunately, Amazon and BBC and things like that have a much more rights-oriented approach. And, people have read the book who are doing that work. So I love it when people buy it, but for me, the reason for writing it was to have it in the hands of people who are perpetuating the bullshit narrative and to try to get them to understand what was actually happening, because a lot of people just didn't realize, including a lot of people of left or radical politics who would sort of say to me like, oh, well, it's just a different terrible thing, this modern slavery. And I'd be like, this is a reframe of exploitation, guys, come on. And then just on the Care book, one of the things that has been very beautiful for me about the experience of getting to write that book is that, so I had this experience of caring for my mum for about 4 years, and realizing that this is a very overlooked experience that people aren't talking about properly in terms of how much it hits people's lives, personally, romantically, financially, physically, everything, work, whatever. And that this is partly because the majority of people doing this in the world are middle-aged women who aren't kind of writing books, aren't out there, aren't being listened to necessarily. And so I had the sad joy of interviewing caregivers all around the world for the book. I deliberately have Global South perspectives in there, because often when we talk about care, we talk about paid care workers without thinking about the implications for families in Global South countries where those workers have come from. So, and interviewees in Scandinavia, America, and all of these people who are mainly women, but not all, have what I think of as these inconspicuous tragedies. This heartbreaking situation happening behind closed doors, on your street, in your neighborhood, a colleague that you just haven't noticed that's happening in their life. And when you look at the statistics of that, you realize, like, fucking hell, this is horrific, what's happening in people's lives, and this is a systemic problem. But most of those people haven't had anyone take the time to say, I see you. And for me, I remember the only time someone asked me if I was okay in 4 years when I was looking after my mum. And I got to talk to these people and say, I want to hear your story. And it's going to be in a book, you know? And people are going to know your name and what you've gone through. And that for me is a form of activism. And, you know, if I'm lucky enough to manage to have events in different places, including in the US, then I will be having those people on stage with me if they want to be there, and they can tell their story. And I think that is in itself like a good thing to add to the world, even if I can't end capitalism.
Thank you. And I think that echoes, you know, what all of you, that importance of these stories being in the world, our stories, whatever they might be, and the stories that don't get told. The telling is such an important part of things. And I think it's interesting that you bring up events, Emily, and that legitimacy that having a book out lends to having a platform. Once you have a book in the world, there are book festivals, journalists, and radio shows. People will ask you your opinion on things in a way that if you have simply experienced it, you often don't get access to cultural spaces to talk about your experiences of the world. And maybe we do need to make that effort to make room not just for the voices that finally make themselves into print, but before then, and making sure those stories get told. I wonder if anyone in the room would like to share their experience of a book that shaped you, or changed your life, or changed your mind, or ask a question. Do we have one in the audience? You're all being very shy. I can start with the question that I mentioned to you, Emily. Oh my God, I've forgotten how I put it.
Whether there are books that
Yes.
were formative to you, but you now look back on and feel are like flawed and you don't agree with. And
Yeah, so about those books that were part of the journey, and that maybe years later, decades later, months later, you realize, although they've shaped you, like how do we negotiate those books that were formative, but maybe deeply problematic or dated? Do any of you have those books?
Yeah, so I think it's not so much kind of what books were formative and that I kind of look back on and question, but it's the ones that kind of actually fell into my blind spots, or that I thought, oh, this isn't the right time for this. I'll kind of like get back to this at another point. It's not that urgent. And then looking back years later and thinking, oh wow, I was just completely oblivious to kind of what I just very easily and willfully ignored. And I think one of those writers is definitely Nawal Saadawi, for example, who I only read after I graduated from undergrad university. And yeah, I mean, Nawal Saadawi is obviously just kind of like a huge figure in Egyptian feminism and in feminism in general, and kind of like a great intellectual and activist. And yeah, I definitely look back and think, how did that not happen? But also at the same time, her books for the longest time weren't available in Egypt.
Right.
And she was kind of like framed in a very particular way. So actually getting access to her work was quite difficult. And it's only recently that it's easier, because there are a lot of pirated PDFs that are circulating. And essentially in Egypt, if you can't get access to a book, a pirated PDF is almost like quite an honorary stamp to have on a book. It's like your book was so good that someone pirated it. And yeah.
Who wants to go next?
I was just thinking, I like that idea about like problematic books, or books that you've changed, or the formative books. And I mean, there's so many that I read that I would probably go back now and feel like, oh God, you know. But actually, what I think is quite interesting is that, you know, the older you get, the more looking back on those formative books, and that's that reading list of self, that I think we're all problematic. Like, I think it's something you can acknowledge that, you know, that I think, for me, I feel like you can learn something, or maybe it's because I did an English degree, so I was like forced to read lots of books, that I always felt there's always something to learn, even if what you learn is your own critical, or, you know, that and learning your position within a book, like go and read, and I think that's always really important. So I think that those books that form you are always worth going back and reading and seeing how much you've changed since those. And I was just thinking, I was thinking about Anne of Green Gables, and it sounds crazy, but I loved that book as a kid, like loved it, loved that book, and I think it really gave me, it was a character that I think that I gave space in myself for. But actually what I was thinking about the other day is about how much of that, what that was a lot of that sort of white savior narrative in that. And that's really interesting to think about how that connected with me so strongly. And as I've got older, how I find that more difficult and so I think these sometimes for me I would go back to all those books that you kind of maybe embarrassed of on your bookshelf and go, because I think there's some real learning in that, and I think there's also something about, I think it's really important for us as human beings to realize that we're all flawed and we are problematic, and I think the more that we can embrace that, the more we have a possibility of making connection with people.
Because have your kids read Anne of Green Gables? Would you want them to read Anne of Green Gables, or is it like?
I think I gave it to my, I think I did give it because I wanted, and then there's lots of books I've given to my kids and then read them and then gone, oh my, let's put this one away. You know, like those things where you go, oh, this is a lovely book, and then you start reading the first couple of chapters and then go, oh my God, this is awful, let's get rid of that. I think I did, but I think they're always really good. Like Little Women, it's really great to read that and go, wait, let's have a think about this and let's look at that. And I suppose it's the same way, the way, and so I think there's always, I think all books always offer points of conversation. I think for me, what changes is the way in which we change in our response to them, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
What about you, Emily?
Yeah, so I had an interesting experience when I was writing the Care book, where I revisited a book that I thought I 100% agreed with, read it when I was younger, and was like, which is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. So I definitely was brought up as a white feminist and have gone through a journey of understanding what that phrase might mean and why that might be a problem. And Simone, in The Second Sex, for people who don't know it, she essentially talks about like two versions of life. There's the version that's available to men, which is about kind of great projects and great ideas and transcendence and creation. And there's the version which is available to women, which is about what she calls immanence. So like the domestic, the drudgery, the repetitive. It's not creative in that kind of grand, idolized sense. And I really, when I was, 19, I was like, yes. And then coming back to it for the Care book, having gone through this experience of having my life completely turned into one of responsibility for another human without asking for it, coming back to this kind of portrayal of humans as the ideal being individuals who could chart their own path unrelated to the needs of anyone else or responsibilities towards anyone else, as if it was an ideal, was to me so kind of like a kind of revelatory moment of coming together of like philosophical ideas and what I'd been through, that I, feel very strongly now that it is part of the problem. We're trying to have this kind of rational, economic, classically male version of life. And then I went and read a lot of texts around care and the collective, mainly by women of color, around kind of understanding ourselves as existing in a web of relational obligations, and rather than trying to not do that, instead trying to organize our world in a way that supports that and creates space for that. From small things like, working time to big things like what is in GDP. So that for me was like really the one, whereas I'd still recommend reading it because it's a seminal text, but it is like, that is white feminism.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Does one of you have a book you feel the urge to share? Well, there is a question online, if you're still being shy. Ooh, and then we've got one there. Excellent. I've spotted you. You're not getting away with not asking it. This is from Nadine B. online. Hi, Mo. Thank you for your courage and incredible work. As a queer Egyptian myself, you are an inspiration for the community and provide hope for so many of us. Do you have any advice for queer Egyptians growing up and living in conservative, divided society where being queer is still criminalized?
Thank you so much, Nadine. That is such beautiful question, and like such a difficult one to answer. I think I'm slowly, almost kind of like still figuring that out, because especially because safety is paramount when it comes to dealing with this, and I think that kind of like it can't be emphasized enough that like it's important to kind of like build community and actually kind of like have connections, have people around you who hear you and see you for who you are, and but still to make sure that you stay safe. I think I was doing some translation work for Shuru El Attar, who is a queer Egyptian activist based in London and who does a lot of work with Egyptian and like Arab queer refugees in general. And there was also kind of like the question posed in one of their discussions of kind of like how to show solidarity and how to kind of like show up and not just for yourself and for others. And I think the thing is just always one step at a time, and also just books for me were a massive comfort. I mean, I think essentially the reason why I wrote the novel was because I kind of like wanted to extend that same hand that kind of like provided that company during all of those years where I felt like I wasn't really seen and couldn't really even see myself. And so just books are a great comfort, create a sense of community, and also just kind of like online communities are available, and I feel like for a lot of queer Arabs that is like a space where we can kind of like explore and learn more while staying safe. But obviously it's a very tricky thing to maneuver. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mel. So we have one question in here. I might get that almost to you.
Gonna come here. I guess I wanted to ask about the emotions that come into your books or that motivate and fuel your writing. Just from the conversations here, you know, you've mentioned hope and that invitation and that hope for solidarity, but also the anger and, you know, wanting to tear down capitalism. So yeah, I just wanted to ask whether you could elaborate a little bit on the kind of the emotional landscape of your books, and whether that in itself, like the type of emotions that you include and that you voice in itself bears some sort of activism for you.
It's a good question. Should I go? Oh, yeah. All right. I mean, I think all the feelings. I think you come. I mean, I think for me, when you know it's that, you know, like when you feel like you've done a good shift. For me, I feel like I've done a good shift, I've brought all of myself to it. So I think some stuff is inspired by anger, but hopefully by the time I finished, I've got to some place of love or open. And I think that's always, I always feel it has to be, for me, my work that has for myself is that journey through. And maybe that's also about self-care, is that if I start in a place of anger and fury, I want to get to somewhere within that work where I can feel a hope, or feel that I've created something which has love at its heart. And so I think that's my answer. And I think in terms of self-care and activism, I think it's about, I think like what you were saying is really important. It's about finding community. And for me, I attempt to create that within like writing groups and creating events and creating things where I can like open my house in a way, you know, to people. And I think that that's, for me, that's the biggest thing you can do with, you know, in terms of it's about community and networks and friendship and yeah.
You go next, Emily.
How about that hopelessness and disappointment that you mentioned? Do you feel like you can bring that in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I surprised myself when I said that. That was funny. You know how you think, because I think I do feel, I mean, I think that sometimes articulating that, you can create an offer, like it was even in that, like articulating that disappointment and that sense of isolation and that, I think for me it's also a sort of I suppose within that, there's still a hope. There's still a hope that by articulating that people will come stand, you know, with me, not necessarily with me in that, but with, you know, with like will show up. So maybe there is, I think there's always something that what writers can do, and what, especially when you're writing poetry or writing, you know, fiction, I think what we're trying to do is to try and articulate a human experience. And the more human we are in that experience, the more possibility there is for other humans to connect. So even if that expression is disappointment and isolation, and I hoped this would happen and it didn't, I think is still the uttering that feels really important. And it is still within that a possibility of changing that situation, I suppose. I don't know how you think.
Thank you for that question. It's a really interesting question. Yes, pure anger in the slavery book, but in the care book, I think the central emotion of choosing to write it and writing it, apart from obviously grief and those things, was a sense of exile. That there is, like when I say to people, I was talking about this with my partner recently, when I say to people, my next book is about care, I've got interviews with caregivers from around the world, who do you think I'm talking about? Because most people are going to think I'm talking about paid care workers, which is the absolute minority of the people who are looking after people who are sick, elderly, or impaired. Even in countries with substantial welfare states, it is mainly women, unpaid, trying to survive whilst doing this very difficult thing. And so I had a personal feeling of exile. You know, I'm not the age, I'm younger than someone would normally have done that. And also a societal one, because it's just completely unseen. People don't even know who I'm talking about when I say I've written a book about that, even though it's like in the US, it's 1/8 of the adult population. It's 1 in 6 adults in the UK. So exile, which is, you can kind of picture the colors of that emotion. And then also to provoke empathy, but a kind of awakening, I guess, like a driven empathy, because obviously I want people to understand this topic and understand what we need to change for their own futures, let alone those of us who've been there. But and that's why I think this is something we haven't talked about, but it's really interesting that we all so far have written in different genres. And so the care book ends with 4 poems that are like found poems, so they're words drawn from interviews with caregivers and from myself, that words and phrases that basically try to give you a very embodied sense of what that life experience would be. And I think I'm mixing genres and kind of bringing in different ways of conceptualizing and trying to make people feel things, that I think is a really important aspect of creating an emotional ride in a book that then hopefully leads to something in the real world.
It's so, yeah, I think that idea, isn't it, that it's an offer, and it's the call for solidarity. I think it's so beautiful, that idea about a driven empathy. That's a really gorgeous. And you know, it's interesting, I'm going to say this. The other day I was at the university, I was working, and there was a person walking on with a megaphone that was calling everyone stupid sheep for climate. You're stupid, you're a sheep. Person beside you stupid, you're stupid, it's your fault, your fault. And I remember going, I don't think this one's going to work. And I think maybe it's like from this whole thing we're talking about, it's about empathy and invitation, and it's about come sit, isn't it? I think all of this is always about an act of love, you know. And I was thinking really about that carers. That's what carers are doing. So much of it is this really hard act of love, and I think that maybe that's you know, that probably what drives real true activism. I think maybe, or maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. But driven empathy is gorgeous. I love that, driven empathy. Yeah.
Driven empathy is an amazing way to express it. But yeah, and I think what you were just saying there as well, kind of like an act of love, I think that's definitely something that primarily fuels it, and it fuels my writing. And I think almost kind of within that, all of the range of emotions also come in, because then you also kind of like experience that feeling of helplessness when the thing that you're fighting for almost kind of like gets out of your control, because essentially I mean, what happened with Egypt is that we did kind of like lose control of not just the revolution, but the narrative following the revolution. And yeah, I think so. Kind of like from that love can come that helplessness, can come that desperation, and it just feels like it's important to give space to all of them. Like you were saying, just to kind of like have all of yourself show up. And yeah, and I think because it's not, I don't almost kind of see a hierarchy to kind of like any sort of emotion that comes into any sort of given work. And I think the beauty about kind of writing is that you can really stretch the boundaries of kind of what you're trying to do and actually restructure it. Because essentially kind of when you're talking about something like kind of what you're doing with modern slavery, where you're trying to really restructure the whole narrative around it, and when you're working with poetry, it's almost like you really need to tease apart the sense that there is one kind of univocal way of addressing things. And I think kind of like with that, you'll feel all of the best and worst of the things. But yeah, and actually, I just...
Yes, I was going to say, if we end on asking everyone for an act, if people could know something and take something from today and do something in the world.
Yeah.
And I see you reaching for Allah's book. If each of you wanted to put a do into the world.
But before I do that, there's one more thing I wanted to add to the answer that I gave for Nadine as well. I just kind of like remember the absolute feeling, just talking about kind of like despair and all of the range of emotions. I remember the absolute feeling of despair and kind of like just being broken down when Sarah Higazi died. And that was, I didn't know what to do with all of these emotions, especially kind of like as it concerns the life of a queer person of color, especially kind of who died in exile. It was hard to, yeah, it was hard to do to know what to do next. But something that I did was actually just directly reach out to people, and like from that just grow wonderful communities. So just I found nothing but love from all of the queer Arabs that I've connected with online, and from that kind of like came a sense of community. But I just wanted to say that. And then when thinking about this event, I've just kind of been absolutely channeling Ala Abdel Fattah. For those of you who don't know, Ala Abdel Fattah is an Egyptian intellectual writer, programmer who is very active since the 2005 uprisings all the way through 2011, 2014, and he's currently in prison. He's been on a hunger strike for more than 200 days. He's been on a water strike for a while, and the last bit of news that we've received from Egyptian authorities is that there has been a medical intervention on him, probably force-feeding against his will, which is torture. And COP27 has been going on, and it's something that I kind of like just can't leave at the door when coming to this event, obviously, because it ties in very much with everything that we've been talking about. But we need to kind of like amplify the voices of the political prisoners, of which there are 65,000 in Egypt right now. Ale is close to death. That cannot be overstated. There are petitions online. You need to pressure your representatives, send your MPs messages, ask them to pressure Nicola Sturgeon, James Cleverly, Rishi Sunak into actually acting. Rishi Sunak recently came out and just said that he's raised the issue of Ale with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He's raised the issue of someone who's been imprisoned with his jailer. This is a horrifying kind of like end to kind of like stop at. There needs to be actual action, there needs to be repercussions. The UK provides a lot of aid and provides a lot of trade deals with Egypt. Those need to be affected until this British citizen is allowed to have consular access and is allowed to leave this unjust imprisonment. And is it okay if I read just a tiny bit of his work?
Yeah. While Mo finds the passage, I'll just let you know there are a couple of posters that have QR codes that you can scan that will take you to some of the petitions and more information about the campaigns that are currently ongoing in the UK, so that you can get involved in that way.
So this is when he was writing about the climate crisis. This is a global problem. The individual whose scope of action is extremely limited and localized cannot solve it except by creating novel ways of organizing across continents. To achieve these forms of organizing, we need first to extricate ourselves from absurd quarrels and reject every form of ugly nationalism. We need to reclaim the arena of local action, not as a space to hoard miserable gains, but as a space to discuss a better future for everyone. The crisis, for certain, is not a crisis of awareness, but of surrendering to the inevitability of inequality. If the only thing that unites us is the threat, then every person or group will move to defend their interests. But if we meet around a hope in a better future, a future where we put an end to all forms of inequality, this global awareness will be transformed into positive energy. Hope here is a necessary action. Our rosy dreams will probably not come to pass, but if we leave ourselves to our nightmares, we'll be killed by fear before the floods arrive.
Thank you. I wonder if either of you also wanted to leave us with something. I know we've got
I
some.
suppose the obvious one is go to the inquiry. 22nd of November, the public inquiry for Sheikh Bio is taking place where the Sheraton is, beside the court there. You can go online to the website, the inquiry website, and you can very easily get yourself a ticket. If you can't go to any of the days, then you can watch it online. So yeah, see if you can find a day to turn up, and it's very, very easy to get yourself a ticket to go. You just go to the inquiry website.
And again, there are some posters that are over by the till
And
that
there's
have
a
a
few,
QR code,
yeah, and there's
so
a few
you can find it.
demos certain days, but that I think would be easy to find out as well. Yeah.
So I'm sure I'm not alone in the room in feeling quite dejected generally about politics in the UK at the moment. But one of the things that is giving me hope and is very heartening is here in Edinburgh, the Anti-Raids group and the anti-raids work that's being done, which I would highly recommend getting involved in. It means that it means more of us are out there trying to check whether police vans are immigration vans and able to alert people, and the more people involved, the more we can actually stop people being arrested and taken wherever they're being taken. It worked previously once here in the last few months, and we can do it again. But we need lots and lots of people, because obviously when a call out goes out, you don't know who's at work and who's available and who's nearby, and you need bodies that can get there ASAP. So Google Anti-Raids Edinburgh, you'll find social media stuff, and then you'll be linked in to get into WhatsApp groups and Signal groups to help organise and help be part of that.
And again, there are some flyers for those up at the front that will show you how to get involved with Edinburgh Anti-Raids, and generally things like spotting vans. There's some handy infographics. We have run over time. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to all three of you for your beautiful, powerful work that you put out into the world and trust us readers with. And thank you for being with us today to give us a little insight into your wonderful minds. Will you all join me in saying a very big thank you to Mo and Hannah and Emily?
And thank you to you too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to
And to
Myri,
Jess at
Lighthouse
home.
Books, and Radical Book Fair
Yeah,
for
yeah.
hosting this event.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Just thank you to
Thank
the
you,
whole
thank
world.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We also have copies of all of their books up at the counter, so if you wanted to pick them up and have a wee look, and then you can come and accost them and get your book signed.